Grief is not the end of your story, it's the beginning of a new chapter. Welcome to the Empower Grief Journey podcast. I'm your host, Chris Mamone, and I'm the founder of the Empower Grief Journey coaching and podcast platform. Each episode brings real conversations with people from around the world who have navigated grief and discovered the strength to create new inspired beginnings. You'll discover how to walk from loss to empowerment through powerful storytelling that will guide you towards a fulfilled future with courage and hope. Today, I have a returning guest with us. I'm really excited to record again with her. Her name is Kyira Wackett. She's a therapist, speaker, artist, and founder of Adversity Rising, leading the anti-Band-Aid movement in mental health. She empowers individuals to break free from fear, shame, and quick fix thinking, teaching the art of radical acceptance and values-driven living. Kyira helps people confront the hard truth holding them back and design lived rooted in authenticity, resilience, and self-trust. Kira and I recorded a previous episode, so if you guys are listening to this, please go through the Empower Journey episodes and look for her first episode, 'cause we're going to build off that today. And without further ado, I want to welcome Kira back to the show. Kira, thanks for jumping on today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be back here.
I'm really excited. I listened to our podcast again this morning and realized what a depth of knowledge that we discussed about grief and how we navigate that in our life in our first podcast. And we ended up having such a powerful conversation that I had to have you come back again because you brought up a topic towards the end about the emotions we feel as we go through grief. Some of those ones we don't always like to talk about, which is shame, guilt, and blame. And so
hmm
I'm really looking forward to getting your insights on those three emotions that we feel.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's something that we'll get into, but many people can relate to this idea of often we will label something as whatever is the most accessible. Anxiety is a really easy one right now. And so we'll see people anytime anything's happening. Oh, I'm just anxious. It must be anxiety. It must be this. And so I think when we talk about grief, there's this idea that we sort of underestimate how much of what we're experiencing is grief, and then we sort of confuse other emotions as being grief. And so we sort of overestimate how much of it is grief. And I think a lot of that is just lack of clarity on understanding what these different emotional experiences are, and also really just how much shame we live with every day, and how when you come into any sort of grief, you are already carrying that, and how that changes shape throughout the course of your grief process.
You know, I'm glad you brought that up because grief in its own forthright is a very heavy emotion to process, a very heavy experience in our life that comes in many ways, not just the loss of somebody that we lost to death or even a pet loss, but it can be many other areas of life like divorce or job change or moving somewhere, even a friendship or a relationship of any kind. And something that you talked about in our first episode that I want to build off of for listeners is that Kira and I talked about the concept that today, when we go through grief or we go through these big changes in life, and like Kira said, people label it, oh, I'm just anxious or oh, I'm just this. It's a very reactive way for us to label an experience we're having. And in our initial podcast, we talked a lot about how in today's world, everything moves so fast paced. It's so reactive, not responsive, but reactive. And we're very quick to assign a label to something or assign a feeling to something. And we don't really allow ourselves the moment of pause to really sit with that and say, what is causing me to feel the way I am today? Or what is this grief experience trying to show me or teach me? Or what am I meant to learn in this moment? That pause that we don't give ourselves is actually the place where we can find our healing. And I love that you brought that up in our first episode.
hmm Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it too is because we want to move, we want to never be stagnant. That is associated in our brain with fear. If I'm not moving, if I'm not producing, if I'm not fine, there's a problem and there's a risk to that. And so I think a lot of times when we're feeling anything, we want to label it as quickly as possible so we can move through it as quickly as possible. And even so, it doesn't even move through it, it's get around it oftentimes. And so, what can I do to not have to have this hold me back in some way, shape, or form? And so, I feel like that grief is a big example of it, but it happens across the board with so many different emotions where we're not even chasing happiness anymore. We're just chasing productivity. And we've sort of gotten lost in the doing versus the being across the board with that. And I think grief is just one of those really sticky examples where you really can't just go around it. you're really just kind of kicking the ball down the line or kicking the can down the curb a little bit, it is going to hit you and it is going to take you out if you don't allow it to be something that you work with and inside of to get to a place where you find resolve and healing.
Well, I think that's what's very interesting about grief is, you talk a lot about shame and guilt, and I like to call it self-blame too, by the way, because we do have that pressure of societal influence or maybe people around us saying, oh, well, you should be over it by now, or you just have to accept it and move on. And we shame ourselves sometimes in the sense of saying, well, I should just be over this now, or I should be able to move on. I should be fine. I should be okay. Life happens. And we start using shame and guilt in many ways against ourselves because of that outside influence of the world from us. And I do think in many ways that takes away from our actual experience while we're grieving.
Yeah. And I think it's helpful. And so, to all the listeners, I think shame, blame, guilt, all these words are used so frequently now, and they're kind of intermixed with each other. When we're talking about shame, what we're really thinking about is this very specific fear around connection and belonging. And so when we're born, we require connection and belonging. It is on the same level as food, water, shelter. We need a sense of belonging and community. That is inherent in the human species. And so, as we start to move about the world as babies, as young kids, we're sort of taking in the world as a sense of how do I fit in? What's mine? What does the world look like? How do we categorize things? What's the in group? What's the out group? And we pay attention to that. And for many of us, we can see those base level pieces. We can see gender norms, cultural norms, race and socioeconomic status, religion, all those pieces will play a role. We can see how people are sort of sorted, treated differently. We look at body type. We might say, okay, growing up, I might recognize someone in a smaller body is treated better than someone in a bigger body, or someone with more access to stuff, maybe a higher socioeconomic status, is treated better than somebody who's on food stamps. And so we start to see this from like, okay, what are all the things that I can't measure up to? And then we start to look at our own personality and we go, okay, it looks like people who are compliant, particularly for kids, if they just listen, they aren't disruptive. Okay, those kids are treated better. The kids with better grades, the kids that can produce, that are more athletic, that are smart, whatever that might be, all of that lays a foundation to say, if I can be these things, or if I can hide these things, I will have connection and belonging. And then shame is basically this version of fear that exists constantly scanning the world for anything that threatens that system. And so when you can imagine if the whole system is designed on doing and constantly producing, being fine, being the silly one, being smart, being having endless amounts of energy, you're so motivated all the time. Grief is like the biggest stamp in the way of that. And it's going to ignite our shame alert system incredibly loud because suddenly you're not fine. Suddenly you're not fun to be around. Suddenly you have needs. And that's a big one for many of us. If I don't need anything, then people will want to keep me around because I won't be a burden. Well, now suddenly I have this emotional need. I might have physical or mental needs. I can't produce. I can't do these things. And so we start to feel shame because we're not matching the metrics of the system. Now, add on top of that what Chris is mentioning, all these societal norms, which have shaped our shame system, but they're also in real time getting reinforced. External systems of either validation or invalidation. People not asking you about your grief. People saying, well, are you over that yet? It seems like it's been enough time. Or maybe they don't even ask you anymore because they've decided you should be over that. All of those things mixed together to basically say, my grief is a threat to connection and belonging. And if I want to stay in this group, if I want to stay connected, I better get through this as quickly as possible or get better at hiding it, or else the risk is going to be too close and I may end up losing it all.
That's a very powerful perspective, Kira, because what came into my brain a lot is that in grief in particular, it's a very personal, individual journey. It's not something that I do feel that the collective as a whole of society can really tell us how to navigate that, how to walk it, how we should feel. what we should do. And you brought up that sense of connection and belonging. And I think that in many ways in society, like you said, when we conform and fit into the boxes and the narratives of society, we're fine. We're in the equilibrium of things and there's nothing to worry about. But that system gets disrupted when we go through a loss or grief situation because
Hmm.
all of a sudden the status quo is now shifted. And now it's something that for whatever reason, many people don't experience very often. Some of us experience it more often than others. But it
Hmm.
puts us in that place, like you said, about shame of I'm either going to be open and vulnerable about this experience I'm going through and seek help, but other people are going to have that experience of I have to hide and suppress this because it's not accepted.
And I think a lot of that depends on the cues and the safety that you have. Some of that is around the own sense of safety and trust that we have in ourselves. Maybe it's something like my husband and I talk about this all the time. I very much experience rejection in a different way than he does. He doesn't really experience it at all when it comes to those social interactions. And so if he shares something with someone and he doesn't get anything back, or if maybe somebody doesn't ask him about him, he doesn't experience it as rejection. He just takes that as data. He's a very neutral placed person when it comes to that. And so if he was experiencing grief and he talked to somebody about it, he's not going to put too much stake into how someone else responds because he has a lot more self-trust and a lot more of that sense of I am okay and what I'm feeling is allowed to be here. Also, it's not dependent on how somebody else reacts. I would say he's much more of a unicorn in the world than someone like me, which when I do decide to share that, if I tell somebody this vulnerable thing that I'm struggling, I'm feeling this pain, if I don't get a response that validates that, even at a base level, I might still say, well, I feel this way, but I'm going to subtly start to feel like feeling that way is wrong. And now I can't talk to this person about it. I'm going to be less likely to talk to the next person about it. And that ripple effect is that more and more we close ourselves in. And that might not just be in one grief experience, it could be when I had something that happened the last time when I was grieving, I got these responses. So I'm not even going to try to talk to people this time. I'm just going to manage this. We also, I think, scale our grief. And so sometimes it's much more accessible for someone to talk about something that has been culturally normed as an acceptable grief conversation. So somebody talking about a death, there's a lot more inherent justification to talk about it than maybe somebody talking about this divorce or talking about a loss of a job or honestly talking about really complicated things around grief like I lost my independence when I became a parent because you feel like a shitty person because you're supposed to love your kid because so many other people struggle with that, and yet you're feeling this grief of like I want to be a parent but maybe I don't, but I'm grieving this loss of what that might mean. And so then whenever we scale it against other people's experiences, if it's not a normed thing, even more so we don't talk about it. So I think a lot of it really comes back to what are those cultural norms that you've experienced? Has your grief been welcomed? Again, even thinking about my 5-year-old, it's so easy for me to want to say to her, it's not that big of a deal. You'll get over it because it's not. And I don't want to feel her suffering. But in that moment, this thing that might happen that she is grieving, a fight with another 5-year-old that to me is ridiculous because this friend of hers is constantly looking to be mad at somebody and it has nothing to do with Everly. To Everly, it's the end of the world for that day. And so, how do I help her grieve that, what that feels like, whether it's temporary or long term, and make space for that so that she knows that her grief is valid? She knows that it's not an inconvenience. But even for someone like me that works in this field, I still have to actively remind myself to create that norm because that's not the norm in the system that we exist in every day.
I think, I love that you shared that example because I think a lot of this shame really does come from those societal pressures and those societal norms. And if you do grow up in a household, by the way, that is not very open with emotions and does not hold space for you to talk about things, that really sets the precedence for you in many ways of life. And I
Hmm.
love that example that you brought up with your 5-year-old saying, I know it's not a big deal. She's going to get over this. She's not even going to remember it next year.
Right.
It's never going to be a thing. But today it is. And
Yeah.
in this exact moment right now, validation is key to show my kid, not just to say like, oh, it's okay you feel this way and brush it off, but it's meant to hold
Hmm.
space to actually sit there and pause, like you brought up in our first episode, to say, let's sit with this moment right now. Let's
Yeah.
acknowledge and validate what you were feeling, what you were experiencing, to know that this is okay, it's normal, and it's fine
Yeah.
for you to be this way. And maybe that helps your daughter, by the way. I don't even know, a year from now, maybe something similar happens, but she looks back and says, Mom gave me that space to say it's okay for me right now to validate my grief, validate my emotions, and to realize walking through the situation that maybe this doesn't have a lot to do with me. Maybe this is something else that's not mine to own. And giving
Hmm.
your child that confidence to work through that grief in their own way without that pressure of shame or guilt or blame, because they're not fitting into the status quo.
Yeah. And I think a lot of it has to do with, for many of us, in our own internal filtering and when we're showing up for other people. I still think about being a kid and being told things like, there's people that are starving in Africa. So it was this idea that you're supposed to eat all your food because these people are starving, or the comments that would be made of like, there's somebody that's got it worse than you, or like, you have no idea how good you have it. And that those comments create and reinforce that system of comparison that we exist by. I'm only good if I'm better than other people, and I'm not good if I'm not as good as these people. Like that is constantly the scale that we use. And so I think sometimes with grief, it's the same thing. What's my pain about? And is that about worth sharing in the world? And I think that what gets lost in that is it really isn't about the what, it's about the feeling underneath it. The fight is dumb. She's not, like, literally the next day they were playing together and everything was fine. And when I asked her about it after school, she's like, oh no, it's fine. There was nothing there. She didn't have anything more to process. It wasn't that actual situation. It was her brain, her body's having an experience of an emotion that's new and hard and scary. And I think even for us as adults, it isn't so much what happened to me, it's how I'm feeling. And that's the part that needs to be talked through and connected with and supported by ourselves and by the people around us. And I think if we get so caught up in the details of the what, we miss that opportunity. And connection isn't about, well, I also got in a car accident. Connection is about, I remember after I had that, I didn't want to drive and I was really scared. And it took me a really long time to stop feeling scared. Is that happening for you? We relate on the emotional piece, not the actual tangible part.
I'm glad you brought that up because that's a great example of, there's comparison in the bad way of things that I see in grief. There's also comparison in a way that connects and unites us. And, I love you gave that example about car accidents because I feel the same way when I talk to a lost parent who lost a
Hmm.
child. And I don't care if you lost a stillborn like me or a 4-year-old or a 20-year-old. We don't always connect over that actual loss, but we connect over the emotions we felt in that moment. And what always gets brought up is the hardship of this person's no longer with me, and I'm feeling
Right.
very heavy right now. My life has changed in whatever way. We don't really get caught up on the event so much as we do how that made us feel. And I think that
Hmm.
that, like you said, we connect on that emotional level. And that's the place where I do feel like when we can remove shame and guilt and blame, those emotions that are very heavy, we can remove those and allow ourselves to connect in realityville of this is what I'm feeling right now. This is what I've experienced. I'm not sure how to navigate what this looks like going forward. I'm really sad. I'm really down today. I really miss so and so that's no longer with me. Allowing ourselves space to pause and really sit there with it and hold space for others to go through that. I think that's where a lot of our healing can happen. It's where we don't live in comparison. We don't live in my loss is greater than yours or I got over it sooner than you. But it's really allowing ourselves to walk that journey in parallel with somebody and support them.
Well, and I think what you just said, even because I think a lot about the shame for us is normal. We're not going to go through anything heavy or hard without having some of those stories. That idea of blaming ourselves, that idea of wondering what ifs and how could I and what's the control factor, that's a human experience. The reason it becomes so problematic is it leads to a silencing whether that is not talking to other people, whether that's not processing it ourselves. We don't bring it up in therapy, we don't journal about it. We just sort of stuff it down, and that allows it to continue to lead itself into that negative thinking. Whereas it's actually incredibly normal when you've had a loss to have blame based thoughts. Could I have done something different? Our brain wants to control things. It wants to know what it could have done, what it can do, how does it prevent things in the future. Those are completely normal reactions to have. It's the silence behind it that's problematic. And so when we can say those things out loud, when we can say, I'm feeling this way, I'm feeling really guilty about this, even those moments where you describe someone that's like, oh, well, I got over it faster than this person, or they got over it faster than me, when they're doing that, there's shame underneath. So, how do we get out for that person that's like, well, I'm fine? Are they? Are they fine? Or is there something about that that they're kind of opening the door for of maybe they need to feel like they're better than other people? Maybe they actually rushed through that. Maybe they're looking for the permission to still process what they're feeling. And I think sometimes when we notice those things, we have such quick reactions of like, I don't want to talk to that person. That person kind of sucks. Like that person thinks they're better than everybody else. Oftentimes, people like that and people that are pushing us to be fine, they are trying to protect the system that they are stuck in. Because their belief is if you're not fine, there's a threat. And I'm trying to protect you and I'm trying to help you get to this place, not realizing that that's coming from such a messed up system of operation that they're in. And so I do think a lot of it comes back to just starting to say some of those things out loud. What if you weren't fine? Gosh, I'm struggling that I feel like I could have done something. I'm really worried about all the other things I can't control anymore. And it just feels like, what if loss continues to happen? What if I try again to, have another child and something happens? How do I deal with that? Maybe I am broken. Maybe this is an issue. Maybe something will happen. Whatever that could be, saying these things out loud allows it to then become part of the grieving process and part of the shame healing and shame resilience process rather than just I stay stuck in shame, blame, and guilt.
So that brings me to one of my big questions I have for you is, how can we work through these emotions of shame, self-guilt, self-blame? Because I do know that, when we go through loss, it's very normal for us to have those emotions. And something that I have caught on in my own grief journey is that those people that push back on us and say those comments about we should get over this faster or it's been enough time or we just have to move on. What I've oftentimes come to find recently is that a lot of those people have not really been given the skills, tools, or knowledge in their own experience to learn how to move forward with that. Because,
Mm,
when I talk to people that are baby boomers, people back in my grandparents' generation, a lot of this stuff that we talk about openly about grief and shame and emotions that we've experienced, they weren't taught how to do that at all. They
mhm.
were very much taught the silent game, hold it in, deal with it internally. We don't want to see it out here. It's just part of life. You got to accept it. How do we, find ways to work through those emotions for ourselves when we do run into that societal norm like that?
If you could think of something that stood out to you in the beginning, what was a prominent shame thought when you were first dealing with your grief with your child? Do you remember one of those shame or blame thoughts in your head?
The biggest one for me is that I could have done something different. That was the like I could have done more ultrasounds or
Yeah,
we could have gone to the doctor more frequently or we could have like your brain spirals. My brain spiraled like a crazy person. Like I could have
yeah.
done 10 million things and it wouldn't have changed the outcome, by the way, but that's where my brain went. Was
But
this
in that moment, it was, I could have done something more. I didn't do enough. And that's where your shame was rooted. And when you would share that with people, what did you tell that to anybody?
I did not share a lot of that.
Okay.
I think I held a lot of that in because a lot of the people around me at that moment in time, I got told things like, at least you make beautiful babies, or oh, you'll have
Right.
another one. Um,
They had
this,
already moved on past this loss, and so that you didn't feel like you could bring them back into this in a safe way that you could feel seen. They were already on to the next baby, the next thing, not even really there with you.
Yeah, I mean, to answer your question really directly, my wife the first year it was so hard, and I hope she doesn't kill me for saying this, but she dealt with a lot of self-blame, a lot.
Hmm.
And it came in that place of I should have known like my body better. My body let me down. I
Yeah.
should have known something was wrong and should have reacted differently. And
Yeah.
that's a very normal thing I've come to find from women that have had child loss. It's a very,
Yeah.
very normal thing and something that I don't like people shaming at all because I think that's
Yeah.
a very human ornate trait in women that have children.
Yeah. Well, so the reason I think this example is really important, there's obviously a line of which I would have a different level of comfort because of my training. So the way I function with my friends sometimes, I definitely have a therapist hat on versus some of us that are listening to this are like, no, I couldn't say this. I can't do this. I'm not equipped to handle that. And so I'll kind of give you two thoughts and insights. One of the most important things is that when we feel shame, we need it to be seen. We need those thoughts and stories to be validated before we can move past them. So, for example, if you were to have said out loud, let's say that we had known each other back then, and you said, Kira, I could have done something. Why didn't I do this? Instead of telling you there's nothing you could do because you weren't ready for that yet, we would have focused on that has to feel so hard. This
Mm.
belief that you could have done something different. God, what a heavy feeling to hold that you could have controlled this outcome. And just sitting in that with you, because that's where you're at. That is the feeling that you have. It's that idea of when you're just worked up and you're angry if someone comes in and they go, just relax. You're like, fuck you. I'm going to punch you in the face if you say it one more time. That won't happen. You need someone to just sit next to you. And I think that part is really uncomfortable for people because the people that love you don't want you to feel like it's your fault. But the reality is, you do think it's your fault. And so the first thing that we do is we need to make space to just validate this is how I feel. And gosh, this is the thought in my brain right now. The thought that I have is that I could have done something different. I could have done something more. Now, the key, and this is where my therapist hat comes in a little bit, this is not, I think, a fair thing for all of us to put on ourselves to do, is to understand that a thought is not the same as a belief. The thought on repeat over and over becomes the belief. And so that silence for you, that silence and that shutdown for you and your wife of like, at least you make beautiful babies, you should, get over it, try again, it'll be better next time, all of that, what we have to get at is how do we help you have those thoughts and then allow the possibility that there are other thoughts before it becomes a belief. And that's the really tricky thing for us is whatever we condition, I can't remember that neurons that fire together, wire together, the more we associate things, there's all this brain stuff we've made these statements around, but essentially the more you tell yourself something, the more you're going to believe it. And so, if we can talk about it right away, if we can share that with people that are safe, and that person can respond by just saying, oh my gosh, I can't imagine how hard that must feel to feel like you could have done something more.
That's the one part that I enjoy about grief coaching a lot is when I literally sit there and I talk probably 20% of the time in my coaching calls. And when
Right,
I just listen to somebody and I've had people say, "Oh, I must sound crazy." And I go, "You're not crazy. You're feeling
right,
things right now and you're
right.
you're processing these emotions. I'm just giving you the space without judgment, without any kind of influence to allow what's up here to come out so you can actually see it." Because
Well,
I notice a big difference in people who are in that safe place.
yes.
They don't mute their thoughts. They don't take something this long and shrink it to here. They actually allow themselves space, like you and I are talking about.
Well, and that idea that I don't now have to say that. And then if I sense someone else's discomfort, I will shut it down and I will be fine. And so if we can give that space, emotions are, they move through on their own. We are able to actually move through our distress on our own if we don't micromanage it. It's the micromanaging that becomes the problem. It's the head getting in the way of the emotions in the body. And so, if we can make space for that, and if we as supporters of other people can just validate that, we don't stay there forever, but just giving some space to that is really important. And then we can talk about what would that look like for you to not see it that way? Is there any other alternative? Is the only answer that you are responsible for this? And then you start to kind of work through some of those pieces because no, that's not it. And there's absolutely, and this is where I think validation is key. There's absolutely no way for you to move through this world not feeling some sense of responsibility. And the hard part is we're never going to know if some of those things would have made a difference. In your case, you know obviously some details that actually there are things that wouldn't have made a difference regardless. But there's always going to be that what if, and our brain hates that. And so part of this is just saying, how do we integrate that? The not knowing without getting stuck in blame, without losing trust in our body. If we could play these other scenarios, you could have done more of these things and been so hypervigilant and anxious that actually your body went haywire and you had so much cortisol and stress and high blood pressure that that could have caused issues. There's so many other ways that we can look at this. How do we find space to integrate that not knowing and that feeling that you could have done something more and reconciling that maybe that's not the only thing? Maybe those things are there. And sometimes bad shit happens and nothing we could have done would have made that different. And that's another really painful thing. It's easier for me if I could blame myself because then I could control it than if I just say, well, sometimes bad things happen and I can't predict it. And so sometimes it is just getting comfortable with that and allowing the ambiguity in the conversation. And I think for most people, when somebody seeks them out for support, they assume a job to fix. And fixing either comes by way of kind of talking through and minimizing or just shutting down and distracting away from the feeling. None of those things help. People aren't sharing it for you to fix them. They're sharing it to you so you can see them and be with them. And if we can reframe that, that makes a big difference in taking away the shame. Because that shame, like I said, is going to be there, but over time it's going to go away. Like, oh, Kira's not telling me that the fact that I feel responsible makes me ridiculous and that I need to get over it. She's not telling me that I should focus on the good and try again and be fine. She's actually just telling me I get to feel this. She's telling me that that's a really normal response, actually. What is that like to hear that? To not have her reacting as if I'm broken and a problem and a burden, but actually I'm just going through this thing that makes total sense. Oh, well, maybe I can let that happen. And that letting allows us to move through it a little bit more quickly.
I think it's a big opportunity, as you were talking, to accept ourselves in that moment. I keep hearing the word acceptance chiming through when
Mm,
you're speaking, and I had a coaching call with my client 2.5 weeks ago. And long story short, she lost her mom, her dad, and her uncle all in a matter of a year and a half, close to each of
jeez.
them. And I told her through the calls, I said I haven't lost a parent, so I really can't speak to that. But I can sit here and listen, and I'm actually learning a lot from you by you just talking and sharing your story as it is. One of the most
Mm,
powerful things that came up that you reminded me of with what you just said is she said, I didn't like being labeled a caretaker. She said, I hated that. And
mm,
I asked her, I said, well, did you see yourself as a caretaker? And, what was really bothering you underneath that label that everybody was calling you? And she said, Chris, yeah, I took care of my parents, but I was a daughter losing my parents. I watched my
mm.
dad go through all his death, his whole process. I was taking care of him, but I wasn't just some orderly there doing things for him. I wasn't
Right.
just a servant to him. This was my parent that I spent a lot of my life with. And to be labeled a caretaker and not a griever and not somebody losing their parents, but this
Mm,
identification that people gave me. And when we got to the core of that conversation, I said, what if you're not a caregiver? What if you're actually those things that you said you are? What if we got to that place real quick? And I saw the demeanor completely change from the caretaker was angry, upset, I'm being labeled, I'm being judged, I'm being told how to think, told how to feel, put in this box. When I got her to shift over to what do I think about myself? What did I see myself as in that moment? What was I experiencing? I watched her entire demeanor change, and it went
mm-hmm.
from anger to acceptance, and it went into that place of this is who I am, this is what I'm dealing with, this is what I'm experiencing. And there was not a lot of very forceful emotion behind it. It was just very much this is who I am.
Right.
And I think that's a beautiful place if we can allow ourselves that opportunity to step into that role of acceptance. It's very hard when we go through grief because we're facing uncertainty. Our whole world gets uplifted and upended. And in many
Mm-hmm.
ways, our identity of who we think we are, all these beliefs we've been taught through life, they all come into question all right in this one moment, which is complete chaos. And
Hmm.
when I hear people say, "Oh, I must be crazy," you're not crazy. You are
Right.
processing a lot right now. And that feels crazy, but I always use that example to say, where did you get that label? Who told you you're crazy? Go there. And I get people to see that this was an influence of society. This was an influence of conditioning. This was an influence of belief. It's not true. You just took it on. And so it's a
Hmm.
beautiful place to allow ourselves that opportunity to ask ourselves, where do we get this belief? Is it mine to own? Something you brought up in our email before we recorded was this concept of distinguishing what's ours to carry versus what we've
Hmm.
internalized from others of society. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I had two things happening while you were talking. One, the idea that you basically just called out in the process of sometimes shedding those labels and recognizing that things are cultural and maybe they were handed to you, there's also an introduction of more grief because sometimes what you're describing is, okay, I've got this experience, this thing that I'm experiencing my grief around. And now, as I recognize the labels that were put on me, or maybe as I talk to these people and I recognize they're not able to be there for me in the ways that I wanted or needed them to, there's these other, I guess we'll think of like dominoes of grief, of grieving that that relationship isn't what I thought it was, grieving that the people in my life aren't going to view things this way, grieving the distance that now exists between us and the closeness that I used to think. And sometimes there's this, I'm no longer ignorant to the ways that this relationship looks or the ways that the world around me functions. So there's a lot of layers in that. And I think as a result of that, kind of coming into your question about what's ours to carry and what's not, so much, if we come back to that idea of thoughts versus beliefs, it's really we get a choice to decide what we believe and how we carry ourselves and what our values are. But we're so fixated on how everybody else responds to us, about us, how they function in the world. And we use that as data to decide our worth and value and what we should be doing and how things should function. And so it could be something, grief is just a really hard topic to think about it with because it's bigger, it's complex, it's messy. But even thinking about something like you don't want to be with your extended family for Christmas and you make that choice and we hear this term cycle breaker all the time and intergenerational trauma, and we're going to break these cycles and these norms. Well, the moment that you do that and you let go of those things, everybody else's reaction to you choosing to do what's best for you isn't yours to carry. That's theirs. They have every right to their own reaction. But gosh, when we've created this enmeshment with ourselves and everybody else's thoughts, feelings, beliefs, emotions, all this stuff, it feels like it's ours. And so when we're thinking about what's ours, what's theirs, we really have to get back to this idea of control and what's in our control, what isn't in our control, and how do we reconcile and release, and honestly, a different lens of grieve that we can't control those things. When that comes to my trauma stories and then being in a relationship with my husband, we've been together for 15 years, and I have a lot of trauma and grief around caretakers in my life not being there, leaving my mom, my aunt, my grandma, these stable figures that would leave. And so my brain was constantly waiting for Jordan to leave. Why would he stay? I wasn't worthy of these other people staying. I wasn't worthy of them being consistent. Why would he stick around? And so I was constantly trying to control the story so that he wouldn't leave, recognizing that it was never about if he would leave or not. It was about getting to a place that I can trust myself, that if that happens, whether he leaves of his own volition, if he dies, if something happens, I will be okay. And I think that is a lot of what we need to reframe is when and if these things happen, when I have the information that this person doesn't fit, that they're no longer going to be a part of my life, they won't be able to be there for me. They're going to view my grief as a problem, whatever it might be. What do I need to do to get to a place that I know I'll be okay? That rather than try to control that outcome so I can be and feel okay, I'm just going to be able to tolerate that distress and know that I have the skills, tools, supports to be okay. And that part is really tricky. It's really hard to say. So, what I'm really getting at is the suffering's inevitable, and I just have to figure out how to work through that. And that is life. But boy, does our brain like the idea better of just trying to micromanage and control everybody else around us or puppet ourselves to be the version that everybody around us wants. So we don't have to feel that distress and that distance because that's scary and it's overwhelming.
Well, I think it's scary because in many ways, it's a very isolating moment when we go
Hmm.
through that. And I think, like you said, and I coach people a lot on this in grief, that our brain loves to focus on what it can control or what it thinks it can
Right.
control. And that's why there's so many people with control problems out there, by the way. It's actually not you, it's this thing up here trying to
Hmm.
run the course. And it's such a hard conversation for us when we go through grief and loss or trauma of any kind. It's very hard to tell this thing, hey, you literally can't control this right now.
Right.
Like when I lost my son, my brain was screaming wildfire, going, "Well, you should have done this, and you could have done that. Should
Right.
have been here, should have been there." And I kept going, "This coulda, shoulda, woulda thing is gonna spin me into an anxiety attack, a panic attack of
Yes.
magnitudes." And I have to consciously sit there, and it was hard, by the way. It took me a long time, a year and a half or so, to get this thing to quiet down. And I say this because this is not going to happen in a flick of a finger. It's not going to happen.
Hmm.
But you have to have that conversation with yourself to say, this is okay that I feel this way, but I also have to come to terms with, like you said, suffering is a part of life. Whether I like it
Hmm.
or not, whether I agree to it or not, this is part of reality. And when we can get to that place of acceptance, that allows us to get to that next step of what is actually in my control, what's not in my control. And
Right.
whether or not anybody walking this planet, including myself, lives or dies today, tomorrow, 5 years from now, 10 years, nobody can control that. Nobody can.
Right.
And so that doesn't mean, by the way, we won't have feelings attached to those things, or we won't have fears of, like you brought up, what if my husband leaves me because I'm not
Hmm.
worthy? Those are normal thoughts. It's okay. There's nothing wrong with you. That is completely normal. But you also have to give yourself that opportunity to say, if that worst case scenario does happen, that my brain is telling me this is gonna happen, even if that does happen, what's actually in my control right now? What skills or tools or support systems do I have that if that thing were to happen today, I can give myself the opportunity to work through that? And that's where I think it's powerful for us to go within ourselves. And I call it doing an internal locus of control versus an external,
Hmm.
giving ourselves that confidence, because I do truly believe every person, no matter how hard a life circumstance you have, no matter what pariah of society you're born in, we have it within ourselves to face these battles and survive the storms we're faced.
Well, and to then recognize, so if we use my husband as an example, we could use people in your life and the way that they responded to you as an example. It isn't then saying, well, that won't happen, or we got to be okay with that. It's recognizing, okay, our brain is looking for control. Well, there's a difference in existing in a state of hypervigilance and panic versus creating a responsive plan. And so what we look at is, in my case, we're talking about preemptive grief. I'm basically grieving something that hasn't happened yet because I'm so anxious that it could happen. And so if I'm thinking about that, it's okay, well, what would happen if he left? And talking through that, playing that out. We do this, we actually have conversations regularly about if we were to decide to get divorced, to really think through that. What would that look like? What would that be if we no longer chose to be together? But then the conversation is also, what is my brain and body wanting to do to prevent that? Well, it's going to make me do this. It's going to make me try to take care of him on all accounts. I'm going to essentially try to become like a parent to him so he never suffers. I'm going to take care of everything so he needs me. Are you okay with that? Are you okay with becoming that version of yourself so he doesn't leave? Because you've decided this is going to be the thing. What if he leaves anyways? What, and you start to play with these pieces, not to basically say all roads lead to a shitty outcome, but more, I have control over how I show up. And what if this came up recently with a person that I'm working with, that their company has done rounds and rounds of layoffs since the pandemic, and they're so anxious that they're going to get let go. And they've been anxious for like 5 years that they're going to be let go in the next round of layoffs. So much so that they won't go to the gym anymore. They're not taking time for self care. They're working through their lunch breaks. Like, I just got to prove that I'm worth being here. Huh. Okay. How do you feel about being in a job where you can never have a doctor's appointment, where you can't eat? Is this the job you want to fight for? Or are you now stuck in a pattern of scarcity and this is what you're doing? Are you okay with that? Do you want that to be how you exist? If we think about again, if somebody responds to you, let's pretend it's an in-law or a parent that says something really dismissive of your grief. Well, what data did we get there? What do we know? What do we know to be true about this person now? And how do you want to respond to take care of yourself given that information? And there's grief in that. Maybe it's that person's no longer safe. Maybe it's, I want to tell that person how unsafe that made me feel. Maybe, you know what, for a really long time, I've known that they wouldn't be there, and now I can't unsee it. And now it means everything has to change. That conversation, that what do we do with this? What if it was the case? Am I okay with how I'm changing or adapting? That's how it brings it back in our control. So then you're not resentful, you're pissed off, and then you're talking to your mother-in-law who made some flippant, dismissive comment, and then you haven't dealt with it, and then you're just mean and hurtful back. Well, you could have controlled that. Now you're just being hurtful and harmful because you haven't dealt with it. How do we actually hold space? What do we learn? How do we want to show up and love ourselves given this new information? And who's the we or me that I'm going to be okay with being every day given this information? In that case of preemptive grief, gosh, maybe I'm not okay. Never going to the gym, never taking a lunch break, never feeling like I can go make a therapy appointment because I'm so anxious they're going to let me go. What does that leave me with as a person? Maybe I'm not okay being the person that's like, I'm going to make all the meals, plan all the things, do all this stuff. He never has to worry or suffer at all. So then he's never going to leave me. He's not looking for a parent, he's looking for a partner. Me trying to do that, I'm going to resent him and myself if I do that. I'm not okay with that. So then my only choice is to learn to tolerate the idea that maybe he will leave if I'm not everything for him, because that was never my job. So, how do I learn to grieve that and get comfortable showing up as I am? And then to believe that I will be okay if that fit is no longer there.
Something that came to mind as you were talking about, and I share this delicately with people that go through grief. It is much easier in many people's minds to manage the chaos and drama they're comfortable with than to seek the uncertainty of the unknown that will actually bring you happiness.
Hmm.
The example you gave of that person that's been in a job for 5 years, it's incredibly fearful. It sadly has become a conditioned environment where you know
Yes.
what to expect, you know how to feel, you know what's going to happen, you know what could happen, by the way. You're comfortable being angry. There's comfort in that pain. And sometimes, though, that's going to get pushed to a breaking point at a certain point. And whether that's of your own volition or your company lays you off, it's going to happen. And so, what I like to drive it back to, though, like we talked about today, is the concept of what's in our control, what's not in our control. What is in
Mm-hmm.
our control is finding a new job, giving ourselves the opportunity to actually remove ourselves from that environment. That is actually in our control.
Mm-hmm.
Giving ourselves into that fear of I might get laid off is giving that company control over our life. And that's where we begin to suffer, is when we're focused on all those things we cannot control. That's when suffering happens. And that's when, I've been guilty of it many years in my past and it comes up in my grief, but I'll just say it. That's where a lot of your anxiety, a lot of your panic attacks come from. It's that big
Mm-hmm.
focus in this area of I can't control something and I'm trying to control that. And when we actually reach that breaking point, we actually give ourselves an opportunity. That's why I say that rock bottom, I don't see that as a problem. I don't see emotional meltdowns as a problem. I don't see those things. I see them as big warning signs. I see them as
Mm-hmm.
big things trying to get your attention to say, it's time to make this shift over this way. It's time to give yourself back control. It's time for you to actually decide how you want to feel about this, how you want to process these things, what you want to decide for yourself. I see them as such opportunities, and I wanted to share that to jug my brain about that. But it's the concept, like I said, of we are more comfortable managing the chaos that's familiar than jumping into the uncertainty of the unknown that could bring us happiness.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that's that kind of recircling back to that beginning piece of recognizing our brain is constantly seeking connection, belonging, validation. And really, the reframe is how do we create a sense of belonging to ourselves? And what does that look like to anchor on? who is the person that I'm going to be most excited to be with every day? And is that person, do they even want this job anymore? And it's that reframing of you get to choose that. Do you even want that relationship with your in-law, with your sibling, with that coworker or that friend that's sort of been in your life all the time, but they've just constantly shown you they're not going to really show up for you? And what does it look like to reframe that question? And I think for most of us, the reality that grief is inevitable is a thing that we want to dismiss because that just means that life is pain. And that is a really hard point for radical acceptance. But I think the thing I often think about for myself is when it comes to control, I like to go to three spots. And whenever I go there, I have to go, oh, that's my brain trying to micromanage me away from pain. So, what's actually underneath it? What am I distracting myself from? And so, the three spots I go is my past. I ruminate. I'm constantly ruminating about something, whether that is a specific thing, like you said, I could have done something better. I should have known. I should have done this. And I do it all the time in little ways too, because I'm constantly in this state of panic and anxiety when I'm not tending to that underbelly of emotion and need for myself. So it's rumination, other people, trying to control what other people think about me, trying to put their happiness and well being, their comfort more than anything, not causing them any distress or going along with things because it's easier and because you should. And then my future. And this idea that I'm somehow going to be able to control some outcome in my future. And I'm so anxious about getting to a certain place or doing a certain thing or feeling a certain way. And that shows up again in those little and big ways. And so whenever I find myself in one of those three spots, it's typically now for me a flag of, there's something under here. There's something that we're struggling with. There's an internal piece that I need to tend to. And sometimes that's grief. Sometimes that's anxiety. Sometimes that is shame. Oftentimes, it's a mix of all of those things, and recognizing that grief is such a spectrum of an experience that we go through it every day in small and big ways. How do I make space for that rather than getting caught in one of my three distraction points that keep me from actually feeling and dealing it with it?
I think that's really beautiful what you just said because it's a reminder that sometimes our brain moves in the past, present, and future at different points in our journey every single day. And like you said, which I think is a very big point, this can happen with very small decisions. It can happen with very big decisions. And I think to full circle this as we wrap up the podcast, what we talked about today of holding space for these feelings and emotions, giving ourselves the ability to slow down, be present, bring ourselves back to that center where we can sit with those emotions as comfortable as they may be. That's how we can pull ourselves out of those points you talked about and really get to the core of allowing these thoughts and emotions to move through us and also allow ourselves to regain control over our decisions that we currently have to make the better choice for us.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Kyira, this has been an amazing conversation with you. It's always a good time when you and I connect, and I just wanted to say a big thank you for coming onto the show today and talking about shame and the grief process. I think this is going to be a very enlightening episode for listeners today.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here. Thank you so much for bringing me back.
And for listeners, jump over to my website, empowergriefjourney.com. You guys will be able to download this episode on Podbean and YouTube as well. I want to let you guys know as well, you can also go to Apple to tune in. I want to thank you all for listening to Kira and I today on today's episode of the Empower Grief Journey podcast, and I will be back with some more episodes soon. Thanks so much.